So we are very fortunate to have Dr. Malone here today to talk to us about language assessment literacy. Please help me welcoming Meg.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. Am I too loud? Okay. Okay. I feel like an opera singer, but I won't sing because, is that better? Oh, I'm a teacher. Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? This is a long title, but that's because assessment and teaching are long processes. And also because I think a lot of times we talk about assessment, we only focus on one audience, like students or teachers or test developers. And today I want to focus on all three of them. How many of you have ever heard the term language assessment literacy? Great, so those of you who haven't heard of it, you're going to learn something new. And those of you who have, I'm going to summarize the very small amount of research that's been conducted on it so that you can just forge ahead and read the things you're interested in. Okay, so the opinions expressed here, very important to say, are my own. They are not those of any of my employers, of whom I have more than one. And I want to thank my colleagues, Iran Shu, Emily Ressler, and Meg Monty for their assistance in helping me develop this. And I'm going to try to make this a little bit more interactive by coming out here and not standing behind the lectern. At Georgetown, I sometimes have to stand behind the lectern because it's the only way to manage the PowerPoint. And I'm really short, so sometimes the students have trouble seeing me. So that was a joke. Okay, so what are we gonna do? I know 4:30 is kind of when I get my second wind, so it's a great time for me to speak, but I realize that most people are not like that. Come on in. So the first thing I wanna do is contextualize the roots of language assessment literacy for you. What does it mean? Where did it come from? Then I'm going to review some of the research for you. When I talked to Angelica, she said, you know, it's a great time for you to review some of the research and maybe to give people a few ideas of research that they could conduct themselves. So I'm going to give you a few ideas of research that you can conduct that does not involve recruiting 1,000 first graders and getting IRB and all of their parents' approval, which sounds better already, right? And I'm also going to talk about its connections to general education. I'm going to try to make connections between the relationship of test development and language assessment literacy. And then finally, I want to recommend some action. How can we make these connections and what can you do to help? Okay, I'm gonna leave some time for questions. Is there a clock in here? Oh, there is not. So if I keep looking at my watch, it's not because I don't like you. It's just because I'm trying to keep track of you. Okay, so first things first, I want to thank my dear friend Angelica because it has been so hot in DC. It was 90 degrees when I left yesterday. It is so wonderful to be in the fall. I'm from New England, so this feels a lot like home. So we're going to start with contextualizing. So this is going to be somewhat interactive. I'm not going to make you talk because you're eating, but this is a poll to see why we assess students. And I want you to raise your hand if you or someone you know, so that you're not outing yourself necessarily, has ever administered an assessment for one of these reasons. First reason, to assign grades. Okay. How about find out if students have learned course material? Am I recording here? Okay. Yep. Okay, okay. Great. Okay, the next reason, certify for student abroad. Make sure that students are ready to go abroad, okay? Mark progress toward goals, toward course goals, to see if they're getting there, okay? How about because it's required, because someone says you, to encourage students to work hard. How many of you have ever had a class where you didn't have so many assessments and the students seemed to be slacking off, so you decide to incorporate assessments to make sure they're doing the reading? Yes. Mm-hmm. To compare results across courses. Maybe if you teach if you teach one of many levels or one of many of the same level and you want to see how students are doing across levels. By the way, the one right after lunch is almost always the worst one. To help students understand, right? To help the student, to say to them, yes, you think you have learned that infamous passé composé, but really you have not. Okay, or maybe because it's the time of the week. When I took Name That Language, we had a quiz every Friday. Every Friday at breakfast, I was cramming for that quiz, right? So Fridays, it was not TGIF for me until 9:30 in the morning. Okay, so these are some of the reasons that we assess language. And also, any of you ever used assessment for this? To persuade your administrators that you need funding, right? So that you can say to them, look, in order to get students to a level where they can actually use the language, we need another couple years. or we need to add a study abroad experience. So these are all reasons that we use assessments. And some of these, in fact, the last one is often very successful. There's a story of a school in Connecticut that used assessment to justify a K-5 language learning program, not even an immersion program, just you know, a language and elementary school program. So let's talk about what the literature says about why we assess students, because I can't write an article saying we assess because it's Friday. And so the quote I have here from Karstens, Wickham, Jensen, and Reese is that quality assessment, and I love these words, is necessary to institute, nurture, and replicate successful language programs. So if you have accountability and you know how students are doing, you can not just start a program, but you can nurture it, and maybe you can replicate it, okay? And effective assessment allows students and teachers to measure language proficiency. How much have I gained? How much do I know? It also, I like to talk about accountability. And I think sometimes people think about accountability as kind of a bad word, but accountability is really a contract. I'm going to do this for you, and you're going to do this for me. So assessment is accountability, not just to make sure that students are doing what they're supposed to be doing, but to make sure that programs are supporting them, right? If you have no materials and students aren't doing well on the test, you can say to your administrators, hey, we need something that was published after 1964, okay? And it can also document success. I cannot tell you enough about how we need to take a more positive view toward assessment. If you can say to the dean, for example, I mean, theoretical dean, not the dean at Cornell, of course, hey, look at how high of a level our students reach. We need to keep this program because we're doing a great job, right? That's been an argument that has held on to a lot of programs along the years. So these are some things that assessment can do. As someone who works mostly in oral proficiency assessment, I can tell you I'm kind of like the stepchild of assessment, you know, the non-multiple choice kind of person. And so it's really important to think about what assessment can do for you and not necessarily what you can do for assessment. Okay, so what do language instructors and learners need to know about language assessment? So I've actually done some research on this, and I have some fairly hilarious stories I can share with you, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about the roots of language assessment literacy. How many of you have ever heard of the International Language Testing Association? Oh, yes. And how many of you have ever heard about their code of ethics and guidelines for practice? Okay, I sleep with them under my pillow, so I highly recommend that. And what I'm going to show you here is that the historical focus here has been on test developers rather than those who use the end results of the test. Okay, so we're going into the roots of language assessment with contextualizing. So what are ethics? Ethics are beliefs that guide how we behave and treat each other. A lot of times when maybe you read the news or you look at what's happening in the world, you say, where have all the ethics gone? Well, there are ethics that are specific for every field, and we have some for language assessment. And they focus on right and wrong. You do this, you don't do this. This is what you're supposed to do. And the whole idea behind ethics is that they're supposed to be somewhat universal. This is how you behave in this field under these circumstances. And it's supposed to, you know, make things fair. And so I already asked you, only 2 people have heard of the ILTA Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Practice, but that's okay. You do not have to memorize them. I'm just going to give you a quick overview because most people don't know these exist. And I have been known to pull them up in conversations with people where they say things like, blah, 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 we're going to use this test. And I say things like, is that consistent with the ILTA Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Practice? It's a stumper. Okay. So ethics and assessment. So the ILTA Code of Ethics and the Guidelines for Practice. In brief, why are there 2 documents? Why do you think there's one thing that's a code of ethics and one that's a guideline for practice? Why do you think there might be these 2 different things? Somebody whose mouth isn't full, maybe. Anyone?
Make sure this doesn't fall. Oh, yeah, I'm kind of not good at this. I'm just gonna hold it. So you have a code because it's supposed to be, you know, big sweeping statements, but a guideline for practice gives you actual practical ideas for how to implement this kind of a code.
And so the Code of Ethics looks at morals and ideals, and the Guidelines for Practice talks about minimum guidelines. What are the minimums that you have to provide? So I'm just going to go over these a little bit. You can find them online under ILTA Online. You can actually just search ILTA Language Code of Ethics. You always have to put language in there because there are actually other organizations called ILTA, and you really don't want their Code of Ethics because they have something to do with like technology or whatever the L and the T could stand for. What's really interesting is that right now, ILTA, of which I'm a member, is revising this code and the guidelines which we were supposed to do in 2010. Okay. So there are about 9 statements in the Code of Ethics, and I'm not going to read through them. You're quite literate yourselves, but really what it really talks about is having respect for the humanity and dignity of test takers, that they need to hold information private. I'm sure you've heard about test breaches of test security that happen. They're usually front page news. Why is that? They don't happen very often. We talk about ethical principles, and one of the third ones talks about national guidelines, because of course you have to operate within a context. That is the context in which you're operating a test, and that you shouldn't allow the misuse of your professional knowledge or skills. I am quite frequently, or not so much now in my current position, but sometimes people ask me to do something like, hey, could you just whip up a little test for me in X language? And the code of practice gives me a way to say, that's not really ethical for me to just whip up a test like it's a souffle, and to misuse my professional judgment just to do something either to make money or just to address a particular issue without thinking about really what goes into a good test. And this one I really like, that we should always be furthering our professional development. How many of you maybe were working in the 1990s? Early 2000s? How many of you remember a time before tests were online? When you took tests with paper and pencil, right? So this is where professional development is important. The world moves on and we have to develop ourselves to go along with it. Some other things from the Code of Ethics, that they share the responsibility of upholding the language testing profession, which means we are supposed to call each other out when we do something that is not ethical. And also this one is long, which means that it's a big statement that we're supposed to be really trying to allocate services not only to those who can pay for it, but those who need it. And then just a couple more, that they're mindful of their obligations to the society in which we work. And that we should always continue the potential effects of our tests. One issue that I find is that you develop a test for X purpose and then suddenly another group wants to use it for another purpose. And so you really need to make sure that you're thinking about the potential effects of your test and being very clear about what it should be used for. Okay, and then the guidelines for practice focus on rights, responsibilities, and roles, the 3 R's, right? So in this, what are the rights, responsibilities, and roles of test developers, who include not just the big organizations that develop the tests, but the people who write the items, the people who train the item writers, and the people who design the tests, which are often, people who design the tests sometimes are not language people, they're IT people or designers and so on. And then we also talk about the rights, responsibilities, and roles of test users, which include places like institutions or test takers or other individuals such as you all, instructors. Okay, so that's what the guidelines for practice focus on. And one of the things we talk about is, what do test takers need to know about a test? They need to know why they're taking it. They need to know if they can stop taking a test. How many of you remember when you took maybe a graduate test and there was that little line, you can, cancel out your name and hand this in and quit the test and your score won't be reported? Okay, I read that part. Okay, so there are caveats on a test that are available to students or test takers that they need to know about. And it's not just the provider's responsibility to provide that to the test taker, but the test taker actually has to know that. So, but one of the issues with that is that, how many of your students have ever come to you and said, man, I've been studying X language for 2 years and I am not totally fluent, right? We are a country in the US that moves very fast, and we forget that it takes years and years to learn a language. And so a lot of times our students don't understand how long it takes to learn a language. They don't understand the nature of language because they have studied a language, but they have not studied about languages. And they're not quite sure what they can do with different outcomes. What can I do if I study Swahili for a year or 2 years or for 12 weeks before I join Peace Corps? Were these users ever consulted on the test and how it works? Have they ever thought about, have the test developers consulted them and said, man, that yellow in the corner is really annoying and I can't see anything? That's a true story. And one thing that this code does not describe is what language testers need to know about test takers. Okay, and so we do talk a little bit about test taker rights, which are often listed on, so the next time anyone you love takes a high stakes test, I want you to go and read the bulletin that comes with it. Fascinating reading material, put down your phone. And if you're having trouble sleeping, it's even better to read, okay? And I really love these, that you should be treated with courtesy, respect, and impartiality, regardless of all these issues. And that you're being tested with a measure that meets the professional standard of that test. But this one always kind of gives me pause, that before the test, you should know about the test. I can't tell you how many times I've administered a test to a student, given them the information ahead of time, and afterwards they've said, man, I really bombed that because I didn't know what I was supposed to do. And you know, there's two reactions to that, kind of to say, well, I sent you the link, or I sat with you and asked you to go through the preparation, but also the frustration. We lead busy lives. How can we walk these students through what they need to know before they take a test? So these are some of the rights that test takers have. In addition, I'm sure in this country, we're very familiar with the high fees for testing services, but it's important to make those known. And then I really like the sixth one, that your test is administered and interpreted by people who are able to do it, right? Sometimes that's a right that we take for granted too much. And you also need to know if a test is optional, and if you opt out of it, what the consequences are. Okay, number 8 is my favorite: receiving a written or oral explanation of your test results within a reasonable amount of time, which apparently has gotten twice as fast as it was when I was a girl, and that it's in commonly understood terms. I think this is the hardest part as a test developer, explaining things to an audience that maybe does not use the same language quite literally that you do. But that's your right as a test taker, to get the results in a way that you know. Also to have your test results kept confidential, and to present concerns, okay? So these two are the two things that I think are the most important ones that we as instructors can help our students with. One, that they understand why they're taking a test. So let's say your students need to take a test to join the Foreign Service or to go on study abroad, that they understand what's involved. One of the things I find is the more students know about a test and what happens with it, the better they tend to do. Not just what happens on a test, but what's going to happen with the results. So if I say to a student, look, if you want to go to study abroad in Bologna and you have to take this interview with the Italian professor, you need to show them your best and you need to really knock it out of the park, as opposed to saying to them, just go in and have a nice conversation, right? And then the second one, explaining the results. How close were you to the result that you wanted? Did you meet it? Did you exceed it? Were you really close? Do you need another 3 years before you can ever think about it? Okay, so the whole idea here is, do we do this, and do we do it in a way that our test takers understand? Or do we do it in a way that we understand, but perhaps is not getting across to them? And why do we wait until the test to do this? If you have a high stakes test, like teacher certification is a great example. In most states, teachers to be certified have to reach a certain level of proficiency in speaking and writing. And sometimes it's different for different languages. If you wait until senior year to tell the students about this test and to prepare them for it, chances are they might not be ready. Whether or not they have the language proficiency, they might not know how to take the test. And then my big question as a test developer is, why don't we include students more in test development efforts? I can tell you when I do, it's super fun. It makes it way more complicated, but you have a better result, okay? So this is one view of the testing process that I think a lot of people have. You can see the test. It's like the sun around which everything rotates. And you see all the other things that are at play. You can see the test developer, your item writers, your teachers, your test takers, your parents, your language. I know you teach in higher ed, but apparently parents are much more involved in higher ed than they were when I was young. You have your language, you have your items, you have your raters, and you have your language testing theoreticians who stand up and tell you what it should look like. I'm going to suggest a couple different models for test development. And this is the instructor, okay? That maybe the instructor should be more at the heart of the test. The instructor should be thinking about giving input on development, on instruction, thinking about how you use the test for results, thinking about using the results for planning, for curriculum, relating it to language development. Have you ever seen an item on a test and you think, oh my gosh, nobody teaches that in first year. What the heck is that doing on this test, right? Or you see something on a third year and you think, man, they should have mastered that 3 years ago. Why is this just emerging? And then understanding how the test fits into your goals, okay? And I'm going to suggest an even more radical view. Are you ready for a more radical view of the test? Okay, this is one with the test taker, right at the middle, where they're giving input on the development. They can explain their needs to the test developer. They can explain the test and the results to others. My own mother did not go to college until I was already in college myself. And I remember my sister trying to explain the PSAT and the SAT to her, because my father, I don't think, had to take the SAT because he was old and it barely existed then. But it was a very interesting thing to try to explain to someone who hadn't gone to college what this test was and why it was so important and what it meant, right? And luckily, since I'm the second child, by the time I came along, my mother was like, yeah, you need to go to the SAT on Saturday. I get it. I'll make sure you have a ride and 2 number 2 pencils that are sharpened. But that was a big climb for us. So a lot of times our test takers don't understand enough about why they're taking a test to explain it to other people. When I worked at Peace Corps, mostly you had to get a certain score on your oral proficiency interview to be sworn in. And so that was actually a very easy audience because these volunteers in training wanted to get sworn in. They had high motivation for doing well. They really wanted it to happen, and they practiced, right? They really wanted to go into the interview. They wanted to knock it out of the park and go do their volunteer work. It was, and maybe they didn't always understand exactly all the aspects of the test, but they went in there and tried their best because they understood what they were supposed to do. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the research. So the term language assessment, the term assessment literacy has been around for a while, but language assessment literacy is a lot newer because very often language kind of lags behind the other areas in education. And so what we talk about is it's the knowledge base you need. Do you understand about assessment? So it's, do you understand about assessment in general, but do you always understand about assessment in your context? And it should always be reflected in what's the social role of assessment. Very often we think about assessment as a one-time thing, but it really has not just washback or the influence it has in your teaching, but also an impact on society. Do all of you remember something called No Child Left Behind? Yes, that had a huge, it had a huge washback within the classroom and a huge impact on society, okay? So you really wanna think about assessment and language assessment literacy in terms of what do you need to know about assessment and what does it mean? And then I love this quote from McNamara, and he talks about classroom assessment, which is really the site of what he calls competing demands. You have big outcomes you need to reach, you have daily outcomes you need to reach for your students, and sometimes those demands are not just in competition with each other, but some squash each other, okay? And what McNamara, who himself is a very distinguished language testing researcher, says is sometimes the demands are coming from us, the test developers, who are asking for things that perhaps we could do better at explaining or sequencing or even eliminating. Okay, so here is some of the salient work on language assessment literacy. One of the main differences between language assessment literacy and regular assessment literacy is language is a tough sell. It's not mandated to be taught in schools like math or language arts. And so understanding, it's not just understanding assessment, it's understanding language and then putting the two together. How long does it take to learn a language? How do you assess the different pieces? So some of the research that's been done, Inbar-Lourie, who looked at language testing courses. So she went and looked at all the language testing courses that she could find and what were the common threads. How many of you took a language testing course when you were in graduate school or undergrad? No, raise your hands high. Okay, so this is one of the issues. A lot of people don't have to take a language testing course, and then they go out and they have to teach, and they don't know how to develop an assessment, right? Not your fault, but it's difficult. Some work that I did at Cal, we did some research with language instructors, in fact, specifically with instructors of less commonly taught languages, to figure out where were the holes that they had in their knowledge of how to develop assessments. Because in the commonly taught languages, there's a lot more history, there's a lot more resources. That's both a pro and a con. There can also be bad habits, right? So if you're working in a less commonly taught language, you can also look at it as more of a blank slate to develop. Glenn Fulcher, who's British, did a great survey of teachers to find out what they needed to know about assessment. I did some work with survey and focus group with both teachers and language assessment experts, which was hilarious. I sent out a survey, which was looking at a tutorial I developed. And for each page, I paid people to do this. So they filled out this very long and tedious and in-depth survey where they went through every single page of this tutorial I developed. And I asked a set of questions, which were things like, how's the page set up? How's the wording? How's the content? So on one of the responses I got was, So this is not really consistent with a post-Messick view of reliability and validity, and a long discussion of what that meant. And at the end, the person wrote, having said that, I think the font is fine, right? So you see where the lens here was always the test development process. I mean, even on a question that wasn't about reliability and validity, this testing person, all they could think about was not the font, but getting their message across. So that was it was both funny and sad. It was kind of sad because I really kind of wanted to knock my head against a wall and say, really? Couldn't you just answer the question? Test developers, by the way, are like any expert. They don't answer the questions they're given. They just do whatever they want. I'm just joking, but sometimes. Then my friend Ofra Inbar-Lourie looked at teacher roles. And then some colleagues in Australia and England looked at parliament, looked at politics and language assessment. This is particularly important when you think about things like immigration and citizenship testing, right? What do you know about language testing? So if you're in parliament and you're deciding that there is going to be a citizenship test or an immigration test, and you just read the levels and say, oh, that sounds like a good level for someone for immigration, maybe that's not enough information. Just saying, okay? And then Scarino looked at teacher education, and then in Canada, Baker et al. Did some really interesting work with university admissions. And then Glenn Fulcher again worked on a materials development project. What kind of materials are needed for this? And then Baker again did some more focused research in Canada on admissions officers. Bart and I looked at policymakers at universities. Lamb looked at language instructors, and Davies looked at textbooks on language testing, and then Meg Monty and I looked at students, instructors, and administrators. Except for this last one, who's been missing all along from all this research? Can you tell me? The test taker, right? So why do you think it's hard to, why do you think test takers were missing until then? Any thoughts? Why do you think it's hard to get test takers involved in test research and publish on it? All right, well, I'll tell you.
Because of the confidentiality.
Because of confidentiality, okay? And the whole IRB process. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So most of this work is very expert focused. Why is that? It's really easy to get language testers to talk about their work. In fact, you can't shut us up about it. It's easy to get teachers and language instructors in higher ed to talk about assessment. All of you are adults, you're over 18. You can usually consent to this kind of research. And usually you really care about participating, right? However, there's been some research that is focused on university students, but very, very little on younger children, on adults, and on immigrants. And that's a real problem because these folks need to be included in the test development process. So why aren't students included? All right, we're gonna vote here. So you can vote for as many, you can vote early and often. So how many think it's because of the time it takes to include students in this process? And I don't just mean the time to include them, I mean the time to get them to come, okay, get them to sign up, and then you send the follow-up email, and then you send the text that morning, and then you send the text 20 minutes beforehand. And then the students can't come because they have to work, or they have an exam, or they forgot, or the building's locked, or their key doesn't work, right? All these reasons. I'm not picking on students, life happens. Most students are just overwhelmed. Okay, another reason. What about the cost? Okay, I personally think that you should be paid for your work and your time. However, you might have noticed there's not a heck of a lot of money in language these days. How many think logistics? Not just time, but logistics. Sometimes where test developers work and where students and test takers work are in different places. So getting to all those places, finding those people and getting them involved can be really difficult. What about IRB? Any of you ever tried to get an IRB? Okay. How many times has it been returned to you for more comments? How many? Once, twice, 4 times? Right, twice. So very often you have to go through multiple procedures and you, for example, I've had IRB tell me you can't pay people that much to take part in this study, right? And let me tell you, I don't have deep pockets. So there's always that tension between getting people in and trying to pay them for something and also making it so that it doesn't seem like coercion. Another issue is that a lot of universities now are shying away from giving participants gift certificates instead of cash. And let me tell you, getting a check issued for 100 people to take place in your study takes a lot more time than giving 100 people a $25 gift certificate from Amazon. That takes approximately 3 minutes per person, not that I have timed it. What about a lack of focus? Very often you're thinking here, and maybe you're including your test takers sort of as an ancillary and not as the focus of what you're doing. You're so focused on this that you forget about what you need to get there. Okay. So some research from general education. These folks did some work on evaluating students' understanding of key assessment terms. And the students used this to judge their own and other students' work. And they found it really effective. They had comparison groups, one who used this approach and one that didn't. And they found that when students used these key assessment terms and learned how to integrate them, it was really effective. But of course, this was higher education. And this other study that I found also included not only assessment literacy efforts to help students understand what these terms meant, but also that they gave input on the course. I am actually teaching a language testing course right now because I am supremely meta. Every week we do a survey. It really does not take very long. You know, I asked them, was class too fast, too slow, just right? How much material was included? I asked them input on the readings, how much time they spend on it, what they'd like me to do differently, what else they'd like to learn. I usually throw in, you know, an extra question every few weeks. And then I can go in and say to them, look, some of you are only spending an hour a week reading. You need to do more. Or, hey, last week, half of you thought the class was moving too fast. The other thing I ask is about group and pair work, and there are always one or two people who don't like it. But there's a couple reasons this works. It gives me feedback, right? So I can know what I can improve. And I realize a language tester teaching a course on language testing, getting feedback from her students on her language testing course is like a Russian doll, right? But I also will say things every few weeks. I pass out the info, it's all anonymous, to my students and say, so what would you do differently? And sometimes they say things like change the date of an assignment or get rid of a reading. But sometimes I'll go in and I'll say, look, I got rid of this reading because I found out that last week all of you were reading 4 more hours and you have an assignment due. And their faces just kind of go, huh? Wow, you know, you asked us for something and you did it. And this is the whole idea behind language assessment literacy, that your test takers, all of your stakeholders understand what's happening and that they have input on it. But one issue here is that all this was in higher ed. And one of the problems with only doing this in higher ed, it's not just that it doesn't have any washback to K-12, it means that we have to start these students in higher ed. So it's not like they're coming in and they're like, yeah, I know all about assessment. I know what I'm doing. I can give input onto this. You, as the higher ed instructors, start off without a scaffold for them, right? So we need to move this back. All right. Another issue is from language pedagogy. I love this quote from Lourdes Ortega where she says, we don't talk about the groups we don't study because we don't have anything to talk about. She says it much better. Oh my goodness, what just happened there? Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, so what does she say? Ethically, if instructed SLA researchers do not study certain populations, we do not serve them either. So if we don't include people in our research, they aren't a part of our research and thus we don't know anything about them. And the other issue is if you read a lot of the literature, it's often through the lens of the teacher. So it's the teacher's perception of what the students or the test takers believe and not necessarily their voice. So it's like when you were a kid and your mother said, she doesn't want any dessert. And the truth was, she did want dessert. Her mother didn't want her to have dessert. And I think as instructors, we do that a lot. We think about what we want for our students and not necessarily what they themselves believe or need. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about test development and assessment literacy. There's a huge gap here, which we should always mind, okay? This is one of my favorite things when I go to England, to mind the gap. So what do we need? We need a ton more research. We need to integrate more of this LA language assessment research and test development research. And so what we really need to do is include all of these stakeholders when we're developing tests, even though it's hard. And the other thing we need to do is publish about it. very often because of privacy or security, or because the difficulty of getting certain groups to participate, we don't publish on it. We might collect information about it, but we can't necessarily put it in a journal article. And that means we can't replicate it. It means we can't report it. And so it might be something we know or have heard, but we haven't included it. I spent almost 20 years at the Center for Applied Linguistics, and I did a lot of research that I never published as well, because my job wasn't actually to publish research. My job was to develop tests and get them out there, right? And so I probably have, you know, anywhere between 15 and 45 articles that I could have published, but I didn't because I was running from one grant to another. And that's another issue. It's hard when you're doing the day-to-day of your job. If the focus isn't X, you're not going to do X. You aren't going to publish on X unless you have to. Okay, so this is one thing. This is kind of a diagram that I came up with, which how language assessment literacy and assessment development should work together. So you start with language assessment development, and you start off with your input from your test takers. And then you report your results. How many of you have ever given the results of a test to a student and they look at you like you have 6 heads, right? So it's often not just like, if they see the grade, like if it says A or 100 or 95 on the top, okay, phew. But maybe they don't really understand what they're getting back. I still remember when my sister got back her first SAT, I actually had done some pre-reading so that I could be involved in the process, because apparently I was meant for this job that I have now. But explaining it to my mother was really hard for us, because my mother was, I forget what her score was. Let's say it was like 1100 or 1000 or whatever it was. And my mother was like, that's great. That's 10 times as big as it should have been. My sister was like, well, actually, Mom, let's talk about, you know, what the maximum score is. So you need input from them, because very often we write score reports and they're not written for normal people. They say things like, you know, you can use the blah, 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 blah. And the student's like, well, what does it mean I need to do next? What does it mean I have done? What does it mean I can do? And what does it mean that I do next? So one of the things that I assert is that everyone has different needs, and we need to come up with a way to bring them together. So our test developers, which are people like me and my colleagues and other people who develop tests, which is you in your classes, need to have a rich and deep understanding of test takers' needs. What are their perceptions and experiences? If a test taker doesn't believe that a test is worthwhile, they aren't going to bring their best to it. And thus, we aren't going to get our best results from it. And we really need to incorporate these perspectives into test development. And the test takers need to have a basic understanding of language assessment literacy. Why do we have these different kinds of tests? I can remember back when, you know, before No Child Left Behind, when language assessment was not as front and center, when there wasn't as much assessment of speaking. And because we pay attention to what gets tested very often. So if you don't test a certain skill or something that comes up in a class, then you're not going to pay attention to it. And what you really need to do is understand not just what you're being tested on, but how does that apply to your own learning? And I'm thinking about my Peace Corps volunteers. They knew what the goal was, and they had a plan for getting there because they had a high stakes reason for getting there. And I also think instructors need to figure out how to use assessment to have an influence on teaching and learning. And what are their test takers' needs? You know, trying to put on the student lens instead of the instructor lens occasionally. So the most valid assessments include test takers in the development process. I actually just worked on a revision of a test at ACTFL, and no, I've not published my results yet. But I did focus groups with, I forget, something like 60 students and 50 administrators and teachers, and it was fascinating. A lot of what they told me was what worked, right? Because you don't want to break what's working. That's the worst thing you can do. And then I found other things that we could do to improve. But what I found really impressive was the small things that we could do to improve the test for their experience. And it was really meaningful. And so I went and I took these results and I wrote them up and we used them to develop the test. And then test with a strong buy-in. Somebody buys into a test when there's a narrative that goes along with it. Like, if I take this test and I do well, I'll get into an English-speaking university. How many of us have heard of this? Like, if I do well on the TOEFL, I can go to Cornell and my life will change. Or for some of our younger students or students here, I can stop going to ESL class if I do well enough in a test. I'll get into the study abroad program. I can swear in as a Peace Corps volunteer. I'll qualify for language teacher certification. So when there's a narrative that's attached to a test, which can sometimes just be, I'll get an A in my class, that can really help with test validity. And when we include our test takers to inform test development and report results in a way that is meaningful to them, it results in well-developed tests. One of the things I did recently with our Apple test at ACTFL was run the score report by different audiences. And the score report, one of the things we found out was that it used up a lot of ink on the printers. And the teacher said, could you give us something that uses maybe a little less ink? Because we made it really pretty. And so we came up with a version that you could download without using so much ink. And that is a very small thing. But if it's using up all the ink in your printer, are you going to print out all your students' score reports? No, you're just going to send it to them by email, and they're going to read it on the screen, and they can't all look at it together and talk about it. That's a really, it sounds like a very small example, but it's one of those things that, oh, well, that makes sense. We can make a score report that doesn't use up your entire ink cartridge in one printing. And yet it was a very meaningful finding that I had in working with these folks. And something that, I mean, I'm not going to say it was easy because we had to redesign a score report, and you can imagine what that's like. You have to have graphic designers and so on, but it was great. Like it was a straightforward fix, even if it wasn't an easy one. I also think that as test developers, we need to think less about what our test takers can do for us and more what we can do for them. What are some ways that we can make this experience more meaningful? Can we make the language of what the test is about more meaningful? Can we have practice tests available for them so they can do a demo? Even though speaking has become more assessed, there aren't as many examples of how speaking tests work. In my class, one of the teachers who's taking my class said, you know, when her kids go to take the oral test for ESL, they haven't had enough practice on it. She'd like more practice on this test so that the kids go in there and they know what they're supposed to do and they can do their best. And I also think that we need to make our system so that we include test takers from the beginning. That's one test I developed with ACTFL. I actually was working on when I was at the Center for Applied Linguistics. And one of the things, because it was a really new idea, we actually kind of just mocked up some items and brought it to some kids and some teachers and said, so what do you think? And they gave us a ton, I mean, obviously we couldn't incorporate all their feedback, but they gave us some really interesting feedback that because we started from the beginning, it was part of the model, instead of waiting till the end and the kids saying, hey, it would be great if you could have like a video of me having a video chat with somebody, which in 2006 was kind of a radical idea. But when they said that at the beginning of the process, we said, oh, okay, we can figure out if we can do that. And so a lot of it is including the ideas early. Okay, now I'm all caught up in this, sorry. And we also need test takers to be able to speak for themselves. I try to talk to test takers when their teachers aren't present, or when only one teacher is present, so they can tell me what they really think and not what they think their teachers want them to say. Which does not mean that there's this huge divide. It's just there's a difference between being a teacher and a learner. How many of you have ever taken a language when you were learning a language? It is the best professional development you ever get because you realize how hard it is. Okay. All right, so now I am going to talk about the challenges of including stakeholders. And the first is resources. And I don't just mean money, I mean time. I mean getting people to show up for these things, because heaven knows we spend enough time taking tests without taking them for fun in our off hours after school. Getting access to students, even getting access to students in higher education can be hard, even though they are adults and they can consent to being involved. So access can be difficult. Experience, a lot of test developers might not be able to have the experience to know how to talk to these folks, having the skills you need to get what you want. I did a series of focus groups with Angelica at Michigan State a few years ago, and they brought me in because I didn't know the people involved. And I could say things like, tell me what you really want to change about this program. And people would tell me, and I was like, oh, that's so interesting, tell me more, because it didn't affect me. I mean, I don't mean that I don't care, but it didn't, you know, if you said, I hate Meg Malone's testing class and I never want to take it again, and I wasn't Meg Malone, I was like, okay, tell me more, what should you do better? And that sometimes we bring in people who are too close to the issue to get the information. And then knowledge, and then I mentioned IRB, trying to walk the line between getting data in an ethical way and also making sure that people show up and can give you their experience. So I talked about all this. One issue that comes up is space. Where do you hold it, where people will come and where they feel comfortable? You know, if your office is in Georgetown and your students are in Arlington, Virginia, I can tell you it's a long walk across that bridge and there is no subway, okay? And that's not just a physical thing, that's a metaphor for where we do our work and where the people we need to reach are. One challenge is access, not just getting to the groups, but identifying who they are. Making sure that if you're talking to teachers and students, you're talking to a good representative sample and not the good students who we trot out for these things, you know, the ones who show up to our classes and like them. We also want to find the students who don't necessarily enjoy language or language teaching or language testing so that we get a really good view of this. And we need to ensure their privacy. It's gotten easier. I think the first few years that we were doing things online, it was hard because we didn't all know the systems, but I'm finding the more time goes on, the easier it is to make things confidential online. So one thing I wanted to talk to you about is for those of you who do research or want to support people who do research, actually language assessment literacy research, if you have access to students in higher education, is a pretty, I don't want to say easy or even straightforward, but it's a group you can reach. So for example, one kind of research you can do is student self-assessment. You can compare, I have a slide on this somewhere. You have a student, you can compare how students assess themselves with how they do in the course. You can do a pre and a post, you can do in between. That's a good journal article or an article for your local foreign language magazine or what have you. So some research you can do, let's not be stuck on our slides. So you can do things like pre and post self-assessment. You can ask students for their beliefs about language learning and assessment and how they progress from the beginning to an end of a course. You can correlate those with their self-assessments, or you can just look at that. And there are lots of scales and questionnaires that you can find online that have already been used. So this is research that you can do. You can also do it with a colleague in the same or a different language. So you could compare, for example, language assessment literacy in Hindi and Spanish. Are there differences here? That would be a nice article that you could write with a colleague. Nice thing about writing with colleagues is you tend to meet deadlines for other people better than you do for yourself. Maybe that's just me, but I found that for myself. Some other research you can do is you can replicate, let me just see. You can replicate things that exist. You can also look at if there are assessments that you administer at the university level, you could ask students about their beliefs in them. For example, your placement tests. You could look at, for example, what do students believe about placement tests? What do your instructors believe about placement tests? What do administrators believe? And how does that compare to what happens? I have a hypothesis, but I won't tell you what it is. So you could look at that. You could look across languages to find out, you know, what could we do to make this whole thing, okay. I get the fancy one. Okay, so where was I? Oh, so you should know your rights. You can provide feedback. How can this help? So I think I already hit on this one. You can look at, oh, this is cool. Student perceptions of assessments and how their perceptions change over time. I think I talked about this. And then you can also use research to improve teaching and learning. I didn't get IRB for this, so I can't publish on it. I should just have a record that plays that says this. But with the surveys I do with students, I found that there was I don't want to say significant because I didn't do any parametric statistics on it, but I did see that in the classes where I did a weekly survey, it wasn't so much that the numbers in my evaluations went up, but the qualitative feedback I got in my evaluations were considerably different because I think the students really liked being included and being involved. And this is something where you can ask them, I mean, with an intact classroom, it's very straightforward to get IRB, and you can do a little research on this. This would be a fun thing to get Angelica to do across the whole language resource. She's gonna kill me. And it also allows you to have conversations about expectations. You know, what did you think would be on the test? Why were you surprised when there was an essay when we've been talking about writing essays all semester? So these are things that you can work on. And it's also stuff that you can share. The nice thing about this kind of research is you can develop one or two things or copy some things that have been done and share it across languages. So a final thought, I don't like the fact that we call it language assessment literacy because it implies that our users are illiterate, which is not flattering, and in fact, it's kind of disrespectful in my opinion. And as testing specialists, in fact, I think I am sometimes illiterate about student needs. I actually do have 2 children, one of whom is in college and one of whom is in high school. And I find myself getting less and less sensitive to the younger grades as my own children get older because I don't see it every day. And it's the same thing. You need to understand what's involved. So what I've suggested, in fact, that we should call it luau. In part because the trees are cute and they're talking to each other, and it suggests mutual learning and no one is illiterate. And what it stands for is language use of assessment through understanding. So that's it. Thank you. Questions, comments, feedback?
Question. What do you think the most subjective areas of testing are? For example, I was doing OPI training and calibration. We had a group of about 5 to 6 teachers, and we'd all listen to an OPI sample, and we'd come up with 3 different responses. You know, intermediate low, intermediate mid, intermediate high. So there was some subjectivity.
So things like the OPI and constructed response tests that are writing or speaking, actually being low, mid, high without a lot of training is actually great. That shows that you were all focused probably on one level. It's really about socialization and developing a shared understanding of what the level is, I think. One of the myths about assessment is, oh, multiple choice tests, they're quick and easy. Yes, they are very quick and easy to administer. They are not quick and easy to develop and make reliable and valid, right? So I think it's very easy to say speaking and writing is subjective because you need human raters to make the final decision. Human raters have done that for multiple choice. And I would say too, what's really important with OPIs or writing is being committed to understanding what the levels say and not what you believe the levels are. That's the hard part, right? We all think we know what an intermediate is, and we do for our setting. But if we're going to do something like OPI or WIDA Access for K-12 or a scale you develop for your school, you need to decide what your agreed upon definition is and stick to it. And what I think often happens is, especially when we evaluate our own students, we listen to it and we say, but Angelica was speaking so well in class yesterday. She was so perfect. She always does her homework. She smiles. She sits in the front row. And then when you listen to her OPI sample, you think, there's something wrong with the test, right? So that's some of it, you know? And so I think, you know, obviously constructed response is subjective, but what you need to do is have your human raters agree on what they're rating.
We started writing on the board and then looking at the text, and that helped.
Yeah, and that takes time. I mean, if you put as much time into learning to rate reliably as we do into developing multiple choice items, you'll be just almost as reliable. Just think of it, I mean, how many of you have ever written a multiple choice test? It's really painful. You know, coming up with those 4 distractors that are balanced and that there are 3 wrong answers that look kind of equally plausible. So I always try to think of it that way.
I like the idea that using the language assessment literacy in teaching, because instead of set the goal and function of what our students can do, then we need to think about the assessment to what should be tested. And then in order to do that, then we need to know then what to teach in class. So I think that this backward design is a really good idea. And we want to give like fair assessment to students, but now we have a lot of more and more students are having like a test anxiety. So normally they do very well in everyday conversation and session, but you know, if it is just like an oral test, then they're just a blink out. And then they cannot do their best, you know. So do you recommend to consider this sentimental factor in developing the assessment rubric or to give them their?
I think a lot of students are anxious about speaking assessments because they haven't had enough of them, which isn't to say they aren't anxious about other kinds of assessments, but then you're taking general test anxiety and you're adding anxiety about doing something new, plus fear of failure, plus the fact that you actually don't know what you're doing because you've never done it. So what you need to do is break it down as much as possible. This is what you have to do. You show them the sample test. When these handy dandy little microphones that I apparently can't use correctly came out, we spent a lot of, I actually worked on a test where we showed a picture of the student moving the microphone in front of her mouth and having students practicing doing that. And one of the things, if you take a computerized speaking test, we usually do a test run, and then you play it back to make sure it's recording. And that actually is great because the student, at least, that's one less thing they have to worry about. Phew, my test is recording. And I have to say, university students are much easier at this than little kids, because little kids are like always fidgeting, and 1 minute the microphone's here and the next minute it's over their head. So that's one thing you can do. I also think warming students up, when you go into a job interview, they don't start off by saying, so tell me the 5 things you're going to do to change this company. They start by saying, so how'd you hear about this job? It's a warm up too. You're getting them ready, you're getting them comfortable, you're getting them, but that's hard because you've got 100 students to test, and how much time do you have to make them comfortable?
They do like regularly when we paired up, and then they practice and having a conversation. So I think that they are well prepared and they will warm up. But at the time of oral test, then they don't know that who their partner will be, and then because it should be a spontaneous, not a rehearsal. So I think that makes them get nervous.
I mean, one thing you can do is, if it's a paired test with another student, you can have the first 3 minutes of a test just be a warm-up and say, first 3 minutes, everybody's just going to shoot the breeze, and then the real test starts after that, so that they have, and say it's okay to repeat something that you're, if you ask somebody how they are, again, after 3 minutes, it's fine to do that again. And I mean, I also think you can look at some of the things we do with little kids and figure out how to adjust them for older kids. Like, you could have them all talking to like Lady Gaga or something, so that everybody is talking to the same person. I've seen people do that with little kids and puppets. But you can do that with adults and say, okay, to get the formal form, everyone's going to talk to a picture of me. And then for the less formal forms, just see how it works with your students. Some of us get away with that really easily with our students, and some of us would rather die than do anything that hokey. So you also have to make sure that it's something that you're comfortable with. Like, you can have them talk to the president and the prime minister and then so on. These are just some ideas for ways that you can lower their affective filter and make them feel less uncomfortable, and also prepare them. Like, if they know that they're going to be talking to, Ellen DeGeneres, and they've prepared for that, they can, be ready for it. Other questions?
So I don't know if I can word it correctly, but then students are so good at motivated, and sometimes if I give them like, the before our exam, this is what you're supposed to do, and then they do too perfect instead of too adventurous. So do you have any suggestion to just encourage them to be adventurous, like make it real, other than like, for example, in our exam, in the Japanese 101, we talk about what you do over a weekend. They're really safe. They say something we learn in class.
Oh, you mean how everybody has the same grandfather whom they describe, and the grandfather, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So that, I think everything to do with the assessment will change their attitude too. So instead of like, how can I get A, as opposed to how can I perform better so that I can use this language outside class. Do you have any suggestion for?
Do you use rubrics?
I do.
So you could add a rubric, and you could have something called adventuresomeism. I just made up a word. Being adventurous. And it doesn't have to be creativity, because creativity is very subjective. You could say, you get 3 extra points if you put yourself out there. The first time I ever had an OPI, I did not know I was having an OPI. I went to talk about something funny that happened to me, to my Spanish. Okay, this is 1980. I won't tell you, 1987. And my professor, she was hilarious, Joy Evangelion Berge. She was involved in the early ACTFL movement, which of course I did not know. And so I'm telling her about my funny day, which I had memorized. And a minute in, she goes, in Spanish, hold on, honey. And she starts working with the papers on her desk. It's like, wait. And then she said, oh, go back and tell me more. So then I kept talking to her. And then the phone rang. I didn't know that she had it planned that her husband called her in the middle of these things. But what I found was that she interjected spontaneity into it, and so I really had to perform. And it was a little distracting, but she had told us, you cannot come in here and just recite it, I'm going to stop you, and so on, and she just interjected, normal things that she did. And I ended up going into the field, so I guess it was highly effective. But I think adding, a human part to your rubric,
The other thing is sometimes students want to be perfect to get their points. And if your rubric is based on perfection rather than growth, that can be hard. A student who starts here and gets here is actually doing better than a student who starts here and gets here, right? I always think of something an English professor said to me. I went in to talk to him when I was a freshman in college and said, you know, I'm unhappy with how I'm doing on my papers. And he put his glasses up on the top of his head. He said, oh, Meg, I expect by the end of the semester, you'll be writing some truly splendid papers. And I'm just giving you the feedback you need to get there. So that's another way to look at it. It's not just what you do, but how much you grow in language. Does that help?
Do you have any literature that you recommend?
Yeah, we can talk after.
Okay, great.
Do you want to take that off? I switched you over to the room mic so you can abandon ship.
Thank you. I'm really uncoordinated.
That's my gift to you.
Other questions, comments?
Do you have any recommendation for placement exams? Because the profile of the students that we're having, it's changing, it's more varied every time. And the placement exams that we had for a long time, they don't work anymore. And we know they don't work, but it's so much money or having to, you know, change everything, or ideally getting like an adapted test where it adapts to the level. Is that the best option? It's not. What do you think about the placement exam?
Placement is hard because it's not universal. It's institution specific, it's language specific, it's level specific, it's professor, and you teach Spanish. So are you looking at heritage learners?
Yeah, we have heritage, yeah.
And students who come in from dual language programs, and
We
students
have all mix.
who maybe had dual language until 5th grade and then they didn't study Spanish again, and then there they are saying, I want to get my language back. What you really need to start by looking at is what are your goals, and find a test that's going to fit your goals. You might need to adapt the test you have, you might need to abandon ship and find a new test, but what you really, I think one of the issues with placement testing is that you're thinking about a long-term goal and not just the goal of getting the student into the right class. Like, that's the goal of placement testing. It's not research, it's not even necessarily proficiency, it's are they in the right class for them. The other question is, does the right class exist for every student? So sometimes the placement test, you could go here or here. And so what you want to do is have the fewest number of students who are into this, like, you see where that little space is, where you could be in either one. So that you focus your attention on getting the students into the clear ones, and then you know, that's straightforward. And then you look at those ones who are on the line and decide where they need to go. And sometimes that's more of a mentoring issue than a placement test issue. That's a, hey, you're a heritage speaker of Japanese. How much work do you want to do? You know, how literate are you? How much work are you going to do? Are you pre-med or pre-law? Why are you taking the language? Because you have this great, what is it called, jumpstart classes? Students taking a jumpstart class have very different motivations than someone who's majoring in Korean. So I would say, I would do a needs assessment of where students are being misplaced. What are their characteristics? And what are the frustrations they and their instructors experience? Because the instructors may be more frustrated than the students. And that's when you need to figure out where the holes are in the placement test. Does that help?
Yeah.
Because the other thing is to keep track of it. It's like keeping track of anything. It could be that the issue is much less big than you think it is, but the people whom it impacts is having a huge impact on you. I like to say we spend 90% of our time on 10% of our people. This is for life, not just for language testing.
In more recent semesters, I have listened more carefully to what the test taker says. So if it's borderline, I often ask them, what do you think would be the better level for you?
Mm-hmm.
And then you can have follow-up questions like you suggested. But I often find that this have a pretty good sense of where they should be. And if you're so bluntly asking them, then they tend to be probably honest as well. And I mean, it doesn't always work. There are always people who want to squeeze by, but in general, I find it's not a good, it's a good technique to ask them what they feel best for.
And, let them visit the class and look at the syllabus and see. A great story is my first year roommate took Spanish 102, intermediate Spanish, and I took advanced Spanish. Her Spanish was better than mine. She was pre-med. I loved languages. I did not want to be sitting in a class with people who were taking it for the requirement. I wanted to be in a class with people who loved to speak Spanish. And so I was in over my head, and I did really well in the course because I wanted to be there. And never once did the professor say, I think you need to go down to 102. And that's why, I am a linguist, that's what I do for a living, apparently I figured it out. But it was a prime example of how anyone who looked at our profiles would have been like, huh? But it worked out really well because I did the work. And really the difference between intermediate and advanced wasn't that much, and I wasn't a problem, right? So I'm like the negative example. But you also get students who don't want to take a class that's really hard because they are already taking a lot of already hard classes, and they want their language class to not be the hardest thing in their life. I don't know what to do about that. And a placement test is not going to solve that problem. Sorry, it's getting late. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no worries.
No, but I'm here as long as you need me.
So please help me thanking Meg for her very insightful presentation. And what I also would like to reiterate what Meg mentioned, the LRC is here to assist however we can. So if there are research projects that you are considering doing, float them by us and ask us how we can help.